Good government is an empire of laws. If you are trying to get your finances in order, and you should be, you need to check out Rocket Money. You probably know them already if you've been listening to this show under the name of Truebill, which is the app that helps you to cancel your unwanted subscriptions. We all get embroiled in these scams where they offer you a free trial and then you just kind of roll over into paying for whatever unwanted thing. Well, there's still a bill management app, but they've grown beyond that into a full-on personal finance empowerment tool. They help over 3.4 million people with budgeting, lowering bills, canceling subscriptions, and more, all under the new name of Rocket Money. They are everything that you and I loved about Truebill, with a fresh look and feel, and they are such an important tool to have at your disposal while you are getting your finances locked down, which is something that we all should be thinking about really at any time. It's part of being a responsible adult. It's part of adulting, as they say. And for somebody like me who's not really naturally inclined to think well about this stuff, Rocket Money is a great place to start. Go to rocketmoney.com/heretics to start canceling your unused subscriptions and save money. That's rocketmoney.com/heretics. All right. I am quoting John Adams there, and Adams in turn is quoting John Harrington, but I'm raising this now. The quote is from Adams's Thoughts on Government, but I'm raising it because throughout our discussion that we've been having for a while now about Athens and democracy and what is a citizen and what is a polis, I've been kind of bringing up this slogan, which also, Governor Ron DeSantis used in connection to people refusing to enforce laws, right? And I've been saying this over and over again, and I've been explaining a little bit about what it means, but I have one last sort of thing I want to talk with you guys about now that we've been dealing with some of these issues for a while now, and that is the idea that a government is a government of laws and not of men. Where do we get that? Where does that come from? And how does that emerge in Athens? Because I've been saying throughout, we'll talk about the Athenian constitution, we'll talk about the Politeia Athenaion, we'll talk about this document that we get from the Lyceum about how Athens is constructed and its history, and that's what I want to look at now. I've been saying over and over again that certain things in Aristotelian thought are prior in explanation, but later in time. In fact, things that come last in the development of natural bodies, natural entities, are primary in explaining what those natural entities are and how they come into being. And this is true of states, because remember, mankind is a political animal. And so this is a really important point, because we have a modern prejudice that turns this on its head. We're very keen, because of our sort of scientism, not our science, but our scientism. We're keen to identify the bedrock of reality, the rudiments of what's real, with the most basic or sort of elementary particles of things, the matter, the stuff, right? But Aristotle has a much, I think, better way of looking at those sorts of questions, which is to say, yeah, the stuff comes first, right? The people in the place are there before the state takes on its full form. Just like the molecules in your body were somewhere else before they were in your body, right? And when you were formed in your mother's womb, knit together in your mother's womb, the pieces of you were being taken from elsewhere, from her body, from food, and so forth. And so, in some sense, in time, right, the matter, the sinew, the blood, the bone of what you are, it exists before you, right? And modern scientism wants to tell you that means that's what you really are, right? You see this trend of thought everywhere, that the stuff that something is made out of is kind of the primary essence of its nature, because it comes prior in time. But we know, just from daily life and daily experience, that that's actually not the best way to get to know the essence of something. Things have a flowering or a flourishing, and we know that they have that flowering because they develop naturally toward it. And so Aristotle says, yeah, the stuff that comes first is the matter. But as the matter grows and it takes on its full shape, we come to understand the form of it and the telos of it, which in natural bodies is the same thing, right? Come to understand its purpose and its form. And that actually helps us account for and predict the development of other such entities better than just looking at the matter. Because look, take the statue of David, which I often use as a kind of example here. Not a natural body, right? Something artificially made, but still, right? It's made out of marble. If you didn't have the marble, there wouldn't be a David. So it is a cause in that respect. It is the material cause. But you could take some other marble, right? It doesn't have to be this marble, and it doesn't have to be, even marble at all. It could maybe have been wood, right? And if you just had the marble or you just had the wood, right, it wouldn't have spontaneously created a David, right? Just as if you had, a lump of, human flesh sitting around, it wouldn't spontaneously have life, right? Unless it were being guided by the development of the human soul. So these natural bodies that come into being, right? We actually understand them better and we explain them better when we look at them in their fullest development, in their kind of final boss form, you might say, or their flourishing. So I've been arguing this over and over again, right? In order to understand something like Athens, which is right this kind of miracle of democracy, right? This birth of this form of government that was very looked very much askance at in the region and in the time. One thing we have to do is with Aristotle sort of look at the ruling and being ruled in turn, which is the form of this constitution that sort of explains it at a theoretical level. Now that we've done that, we can look at the matter, right? We can look at the history of how this thing came into being and understand it as kind of a growth and development. And it becomes really fascinating to observe how there are all sorts of historical accidents, right? There are all sorts of things that occur in this history that could have gone otherwise. And in fact, in some cases, in many cases, the people who developed the Athenian constitution or contributed to the development of the Athenian constitution weren't sitting out saying, I'm going to make a democracy, right? I'm going to create something with this form in mind. And yet the thing took that shape, right? So this is a very mysterious thing that, Aristotle helps us to understand. And he also leaves us this document, the Constitution of Athens, which is either by him directly or by somebody from his school. And I want to look a little bit at that today, and also just a little bit at the history of Athenian democracy, because it's like so much fun, such a wild and rollicking story in and of itself that we should discuss it. So let's get into it. If you are hiring, you need Indeed. You want to get this done right when you run a business or when you're in charge of hiring for a business. People are so important. People who believe in what you're doing, people you like to work with, people who are competent and capable and have the qualifications you need. Now, it can be really tough, especially, with kind of the internet and all the different fora that you have for doing this sort of thing. It can be really tough to get those applications that you want to read in an efficient way. And that is why you need Indeed. They are the hiring partner where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. And they're the only job site where you're guaranteed to find quality applications that meet your must-have requirements, or else you don't pay. This is why I think they're such a lifesaver, because you don't want to be spending your time rifling through all of these applications. You want to be running your business, right? But you do need good people. That's why you need Indeed. Soundfront, which makes Young Heretics, hires through Indeed, and it's a huge success. They really do great work. When you go to Indeed.com/heretics, you will get a $75 sponsored job credit. That's Indeed.com/heretics to claim your $75 job credit and start hiring right now. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Now, we haven't really talked that much on this show, I don't think, about the kind of, archaic history of Athens. I've talked a lot about the different periods of ancient history, right, and Athenian history specifically, Greek history, right, the archaic period, the classical period, the Hellenistic period. But typically, when I've been talking about, Athens had the ecclesia and they had the jury courts and they had these forms of government that Aristotle is talking about, I've been kind of taking it as a finished thing, as its final form, right? But I haven't been describing the situation all the way leading up to that point. And in fact, Athens does not spring like Athena from the head of Zeus, right, into being, and begins, way back in kind of the mists of, prehistorical time, not in the sense of, that we typically think of like Neanderthals or whatever, but just in the sense that in order to really go back to like the very beginning, we have to go back into myth, into places where there's no really good historical record. And even, Herodotus and our, early historians who look back into this time are having to rely on the stories people tell. But one of the things that I often suggest on this show is that the stories people tell are not just stories, right? They are not, just kind of idle fairy tales. They actually contain a sort of public consciousness of what the rudimentary features or character of a place are that can't be expressed in any other way. I've cited before the kind of Jungian idea that dreams are private myths, right? And then the Stephen Fry kind of reversal of that myths then are public dreams. And I think this is a really good way to think about them. So let's start here. Let's start with these kind of mythical kings of Athens and understand how it came to be that this state goes from being kind of like any other, state or group of people in this area in this time, which is to say, tribalist and ruled by king. Aristotle says that rule by king is the kind of most obvious and, immediate form of rule, and how it comes into being that they get this idea in their head that we shouldn't be governed by men, like Adams said, right? That there shouldn't be somebody who, based on his own personal caprice, based on his own, ideas about what he particularly wants at this time, or what he thinks is going to benefit his buddies, right? That shouldn't determine how we're going to live, what we're going to have to do, but rather that there should be rules for all, right? The Herodotian description of this is isonomia. Iso meaning equal, right? Isos is equal, and nomos is law. And this equality of law, or equality before the law, is one of the great gifts of Athens and of our classical inheritance to us. And we compare it with, Harrington, whom I mentioned. There was Adams was quoting this guy, James Harrington. And Harrington compares this with the idea that some man or some few men subject a city or a nation and rule it according to his or their private interest, which, because the laws in such cases are made according to the interests of a man or of some few families, may be said to be the empire of men and not of laws. And in some ways, this is the kind of rudimentary state of man. This is this material. You want to talk about the development, or refinement away from the most obvious kind of brute forms of life, right? Prior in time, but posterior in explanation, right? We are leading in Athens away from this empire of man toward an empire of laws. And so the question becomes, well, how, right? Why and how? And in some ways, it's a mystery that can never be answered, but it's worth thinking about, right? Okay, so turn back the clock way back. Athens kind of begins in the popular imagination with this guy Cecrops or Cecrops, and it's called Cecropia, right? Named after him. And this is, the Cecropia is the name before Athens of the place that will become Athens, right? And there's this legend, which I love, that Athena and Poseidon are fighting over the patronage of this soon-to-be great place, right? This nation that they know will be great. And so they're offering different gifts to Cecrops. And Athena is the goddess of wisdom, right? Who we know is ultimately going to become the patron goddess of Athens, right? And so she offers the olive tree. And Poseidon offers, this sort of gushing ocean on the Acropolis, the salt sea on the Acropolis, which represents kind of maritime power or power over the waves, right? And Cecrops looks at this and he says, that these are both great gifts, but the olive tree can produce many different things. There's wisdom in it, right? Because you can get olive oil, you can use the wood. It's incredibly versatile. And this idea of versatility and of ingenuity, right? Of the patron goddess of wisdom granting you the multi-purpose gift, right? Becomes the thing that Athens plunks for. Now, the interesting thing about that, of course, is that always in the background is this maritime idea, right? The Battle of Salamis later on becomes a foundational battle for the inauguration of the classical period. And so this alternative Athens, right? This, in some ways, this shadow Athens, right? The Athens of military might, the Athens of victory at sea and trade, right? In some ways, the more venal Athens is kind of hovering in the background of the higher, more refined Athens of Athena. And so from the very beginning of these myths, you have this idea of the character of a city, which is kind of being played out in history as we go. So moving on, right? Kekrops is said to have established these kind of rudimentary forms of life and ritual, right? Marriage, reading, writing, ceremonial burial, these kind of baseline things that you need in a state that would be what Aristotle would describe, right, as kind of the fundaments of life together. We move on now to Erichthonius, who another great story, right? Athena goes and asks the god Hephaestus for weapons. Now, Hephaestus is the smith god who works in the forge of the volcano, right? And he's lame, so he's crippled, and in mythology, this makes him sort of repugnant or repulsive. And Athena, right? Easy to get them confused. Athena visits him to ask for weaponry because she's also the goddess of war. Hephaestus is overcome with lust for her and tries to rape her. Now, she's a virgin goddess, right? She's sort of sworn to this detachment from the flesh, and in her wisdom, right, is kind of above such things. So, of course, she's revolted by this, very fleshly being coming up at her and trying to rape her. She pushes him away, but his semen falls on her thigh. These incredibly evocative and fleshy myths, right, that come out of this. We talk a lot about Greek myth, and we think, there's the great heroes, and we're going to get to Theseus in a bit, and we tell a lot of those stories. But some of these things are really weird, man. I mean, the feverishest of fever dreams is kind of what we're up against here. But again, always expressive, right, of these kind of chthonic forces, and I use that term advisedly because the person that is going to be born out of the semen that Athena then wipes off of her thigh, right, falls on the ground, and out comes Erichthonius, who is this next king of Athens, and his name has chthon in it, the earth, right? And so this is where we get this idea, in part at least, that the Athenians are sprung from the earth of Cecropia, of Athens, right, of this place, and the land and the people belong to one another. Now, of course, this doesn't happen, right? Nobody nobody springs out of the earth or is spontaneously generated. But what are we saying here, right? We're saying effectively that this is our place, and as long back as we can remember, right, we've been here. And so you might think in some ways about, Plato's noble mythos, right, his noble lie or his noble myth, which tells about people coming out of the earth with certain metals mixed into their souls. And in some ways, that's like he was taking this myth and twisting it around to support his political regime with that, right? Because there's already this myth that exists, that Athens, that this location has been kind of the birthplace of these people. And that's going to be important, right, as we get into this transition into a government of laws and not of men, right? Because the government of men, right, I associated it earlier with tribalism, and that is basically one of the things that kind of typically governs a society, right? Is the people that are related to you, that are close to you by blood. This land has been occupied by this family for this many generations, and they have this much wealth, and so on and so forth. And so this is, I'm actually not knocking this as a human impulse. It's part of, how we naturally are. It's just that in its, raw form, in its untutored form, it gives birth to all of these injustices, of course, right? Because of all the things that I've just listed, right? All the tribalism and the cronyism and the sort of unfair distribution of wealth, right? Which we're going to get into in a sec. But this is here, right? This kind of rudiment, both of Athenian wisdom, but also earthy birth from the ground, right? Next thing that happens, sort of skip ahead a little bit, we get Theseus. Now, Theseus is like, how to put it? I mean, you know how Superman stands for truth, justice, in the American way, although I think they kind of cut that out because they went woke or something, but that's the idea, right? Superman is the heroic embodiment of us, right? He's what we dream that we are as a nation, or what we aspire to be. And this is Theseus for Athens. Plutarch, the great sort of biographer and essayist, in his Parallel Lives, which is where he compares kind of, people that are analogous to one another or comparable to one another in history, Plutarch puts Theseus alongside Romulus for Rome, right? So again, a semi-mythological, or mostly mythological even, hero, right? Born with divine ancestry, who sails in, right, and founds the city proper in some ways. And so, we have in between Erichthonius and Theseus, we have Aegeus, right, who's another one of these early mythological kings, right? He's childless. He wants an heir. So he says to the Oracle of Delphi, which is a kind of mainstay of all of these stories. There's always this, the consultation with the Delphic Oracle, the priestess of Apollo. She says this weird thing always, that they're always giving you these kind of cryptic pronunciations. She says, "Do not loosen the bulging mouth of the wineskin until you have reached the height of Athens, lest you die of grief." Now, this is almost impossible to understand. So he gets advice from this guy, Pythias, the king of Troezen. And Pythias understands but keeps secret the meaning of the prophecy, and gets Aegeus drunk. And he knows that what will happen next is that he'll sire his future heir. And so Pythias' daughter Ethra, right, sleeps with Aegeus. Theseus is born, right? But he's estranged. He's one of these kind of foreign, scions. One of these people, like sort of like Oedipus, right, who's kind of estranged from his homeland, has to make his way back to it through all sorts of trials and tribulations. When he gets there, Aegeus is now with Medea, another one of the great figures from Greek mythology, right? Everybody loves Medea or loves to hate her, depending on how you feel. She's been quite hard done by, it must be said. She helps Jason in his quest for the Golden Fleece, right? You may know this story. She and Jason have this kind of quasi marriage, something a little bit like Aeneas and Dido. He abandons her. He gets another wife. This is the subject of Euripides' grand tragedy, Medea, at the end of which she goes flying off on her chariot with dragons, right, having murdered her own children in revenge. This is an incredibly riveting figure, both the battered woman and the cackling witch sort of at once. And she's now with Aegeus. She sees Theseus, recognizes who he is, and tries to get him poisoned, but Aegeus finds out who he is beforehand, recognizes this mythological mark of his birth, and then Theseus ends up in control of Athens, the mythical king of Athens, and he appears in many, many tragedies and myths, right, to kind of embody the true way of Athenian, persuasion, the kind of strength married with nobility. And so we have these, various different myths kind of uniting into one, right, to give you the picture of the character of a place. And it springs forth from the ground, right? It has the divine aegis of Athena, who is this kind of pure goddess of wisdom. It also, though, has this kind of background of somewhat more chthonic or unspoken forces. You have the kind of Poseidon element of it all. You have the Hephaestus, the semen of Hephaestus, kind of giving birth to the people. And that's kind of where we are when we start to enter into places where we're maybe butting up against the idea of history. Right? We have all these kind of ideas about what Athens is, and it feeds into the advent of the reign of Draco. You've probably heard of Draco, but you may not. He may not be the kind of guy you think he is. Let's get into Draco's reforms here, because he's a crucial part of the story of the journey toward a government of laws. It is time for tea that doesn't hate you, and that's why Gold River Trading Company is the place to get your tea. It's not just because their tea is great, although it is, and as I have said many a time before, it's not easy to get great tea in the States. It's a lot easier in the UK or abroad, but here in America, we don't have a lot of great tea options. Gold River is fantastic. I especially like their American breakfast, their 1776 blend, but they've got all kinds of other flavors depending on what you like. And on top of that, you know that you're not giving money to people who hate you or are going to be enforcing all sorts of, woke mandates upon their employees. None of that is true of Gold River Trading Company. They love America. They believe in the values that we stand for here at Young Heretics on this show. That is why I'm delighted to partner with them and to drink their delicious tea. So go to goldriverco.com and save 15% off all orders using the discount code Heretics. That's 15% off just for my listeners at goldriverco.com when you use the promo code Heretics, Heretics. Don't buy tea from people who hate you. Buy the best tea from people who love America. goldriverco.com, promo code Heretics. So now we can start putting dates on things, right? Because we're kind of in the realm where we're going to, the closer we get to somebody like Herodotus, right, in the 5th century BC or Thucydides, the closer we get to the to things that are actually historically verified, because the whole methodology of history, right, is coming into being, and opsis eyewitness account is starting to have value, right, for scholars, and Thucydides, as we've discussed, is going to really like nail down some of these requirements. But before those guys were around, right, to make those requirements, you don't get records of the kind that you would be able to use to tell what actually happened. And obviously we know that, like, there's no Athena, so these things didn't literally happen, but they do, as I've argued, right, contain this important information about how Athens perceives itself, right, what it understands itself to be. Now you have Draco. Draco, not Malfoy, right? Not the villain of Harry Potter, but Draco or Dracon, which some people think may be a name associated with a lot of these mythical kings, like Cecrops and Erichthonius, are represented either as snakes, as having the body of snakes, or as wrestling with snakes. And this is another kind of feature of this hereditary ancestral mythology, right? Is the snake is kind of a ruling figure. So perhaps Dracon kind of that might harken back to this, because Dracon means snake or lizard in Greek. But it may just well have been his real name. We're in the 7th century BC now, the 600s BC, and we're focusing especially on the date of 621. It's not entirely exact, but seems like a good place to kind of put our finger. 621, we get the laws of Draco, which are written down. And this is super important because Draco, right, the reason why Draco Malfoy in some ways is called Draco Malfoy, besides the fact that it means dragon, is that we have our idea of draconian, right, of just severe, harsh punishment. And this is because there are, extremely harsh penalties for all sorts of things, especially homicide, right, in the draconian law. And the Greeks themselves would later come to say that these laws were written in blood and not in ink, right? So it's not like we are inventing this idea. And so on that level, he hasn't been, hard done by in the historical record. But there is one way in which I think he has been hard done by. And that is that, when we say, oh, Draco was this, evil guy, we always have to ask compared to what, right? Just the same way that when we say, well, oh, Athenian democracy, right, was only available to citizen men of age, right? And women and slaves were kept out. And this is like, it's certainly true, and there's no problem with mentioning it, but to suggest that somehow invalidates this miraculous achievement that we're going to be talking about here, how it comes into being, is ludicrous, because you always have to ask, what's the context in which this is going on? And the context in which this is going on is that murder, especially, right, in primitive societies, is a tribal affair. It's a religious affair, and it's a tribal affair. So, Bob kills Joe, and the house of Joe, right, is now engaged in raining holy hell down upon the house of Bob. And we know, famously, from, you only have to watch The Godfather to know how this plays out. This is an unending cycle of violence. And we've sort of visited this a little bit before in Athenian history. But they were acutely conscious, the Athenians were, that this kind of thing never finished, because of course when the house of Joe rains violence down upon the house of Bob, Bob Jr., right, Bob's son, is not going to then like grow up and be like, well, justice has been done. Like he's going to think probably that Bob had reason to kill Joe, and so now he's been deprived of a father, and he has this vendetta, right, forever against. I always think of The Simpsons, farfalla vendetta, when Sideshow Bob's son is born. This is an obscure reference, but when Sideshow Bob's son is born, he's born to a passionate Italian, and he sees a little butterfly flying by. Farfalla is butterfly in Italian. He says farfalla vendetta, and pulls out his knife to try to kill it. And so this is like the kind of parody of the idea that these things then get ingrained, like the Hatfields and the McCoys in Mark Twain, right? These things get ingrained into the ancestral memory, just like these myths do. And if your myths are about an ancestry that goes back to the very dirt, right, that goes back to the soil of the earth, how can you ever escape the notion that you're just going to be in these constant back and forth blood feuds? This is what Draco is trying to deal with. This is the problem that Draco is there to solve. Once you write the rules down, like anybody that can read can go and find them out, right? So maybe they're very harsh, but we compare them. They're often compared to the Code of Hammurabi, right, in the Near East. And this is this remarkable stone document, right, with written rules. And it's an apt comparison because that too has very harsh penalties for things like murder and theft. But once the penalty is paid, it's paid, right? As Lincoln said after the Civil War, right? We've paid the price now for this sin, and now we're going to stitch up our wounds. And so, actually, even though we think of these as draconian laws, they're actually laws designed to put a limit, right? To put a discernible, definable cap on bloodshed. So, crucial turn, right, away from tribal violence as the mode of so-called justice, right? Toward isonomia, toward this idea that laws apply across the board, and once justice has been done, it's been done. Let me read now from the Constitution of Athens. I think I mentioned earlier in an earlier episode that the Lyceum, Aristotle's school, collected, they say, 158 constitutions of city-states in and around Greece. And of those, only one survives. As I mentioned, we don't know whether it was Aristotle's work or whether it was the work of somebody within the Lyceum, but we're pretty sure he signed off on it, right? Because he talks about having gathered these constitutions in the Politics. So let's read the part about Draco in the Constitution of Athens, because it's got a lot of interesting stuff to say. So I was reading from Carnus Lord's translation of the Politics. I've now switched, as I think I mentioned before, to the Stephen Everson edition in Cambridge Text and the History of Political Thought of the Politics and Constitution of Athens, both very worth checking out. But this one has the Constitution of Athens in it. So here's near the beginning of about the history of the Constitution. The primitive Constitution before the time of Draco was as follows. Eligibility for office depended on birth and wealth, while tenure was at first for life and later for a period of 10 years. The most powerful and earliest of the political offices were those of the king archon, the polemarch, and the archon. So an archon is one who rules, right? And this is going to be one of the earliest, oldest political offices in Athens. There's something called the archon basileus, which obviously refers back to a time of kingship because basileus means king, the king archon. And this is, from of old in Athenian society. The first was that of the king being traditional, while the office of polemarch, that is the leader of war, right, was the first added to this because of the incompetence of some of the kings in war. Delegation. We've talked about this before in terms of warlords and Beowulf, right? That the first thing that happens is you get your strong man who wins power in the good old-fashioned way, right, of beating guys over the head with rocks. But then he wants to establish some sort of dynasty. Perhaps his son succeeds him. And then you get somebody that maybe isn't all that good at war, and you have to start delegating to people like Beowulf, right, who are either hired hands or, sworn vassals, sworn servants of the king. And in Athens, this takes the form of the office of the polemarch. It was in this way that they sent for Ion in a crisis. The last of the three was that of the archon. Most people say it was established at the time of Medon, though some say it was under Acastus, arguing from the fact that the 9 archons swear to observe their oaths, as was done under Acastus, that it was at this time that the sons of Codrus surrendered the kingship in return for the powers granted to the archon. Whichever of these alternatives is true, the difference of date is not great. That the archonship was the last of the 3 offices is shown by the fact that the archon does not control any of the traditional ceremonies, as the king archon and the polemarch do, but only ceremonies which are later editions. Now, this is really actually kind of interesting and important, right? You note that succession in time, which the author is kind of identifying. King Archon, again, rudimentary, right? To have a king, the strong guy rules, right? Rulership, rests with the strong. Then you have this kind of next stage of delegation, removal or abstraction away, right? Actually, we're going to have a meritocracy. We're going to call on people who can help us in times of war. That's the polemarch. And then you have the archon, right, which is going to become, there's going to be 9 of them. And this becomes kind of like the first thing that we would recognize as a political office. And so these developments over time, right, have the kind of shape that Aristotle is teaching us to recognize, right? To understand something that comes in its kind of rudimentary form, almost out of the soil, right, with all of these kind of blood ties and all of these tribal allegiances, and then gets refined, right, gradually into something that demonstrates a greater form of true equality, right, equality before the law. Still very early days, of course, right. I'm not talking about like the magic transformation here into like 21st century democracy. Not that we like are doing so hot ourselves, but anyway. here's the advent of Draco. The above is an outline of the first constitution. A short time after this, in the archonship of Aristarchus, the archons give their names to years. So you get, the archonship year of Aristarchus. Draco introduced his legislation. The constitution was as follows. Political power had been handed over to those who provided for their own armor. They chose the 9 archons and the treasurers from those men who had an unencumbered property qualification of not less than 10 minae. The lesser magistrates were chosen from those who armed themselves, while the strategi, that is the generals, right, and cavalry commanders, had to show unencumbered property to the value of at least 100 minae and legitimate children by citizen wives not less than 10 years old. The prytanes had to receive sureties for them. We're going to get into some of these terms in a second, right? And the generals and cavalry commanders the previous year until after their euthuna, that is their kind of post-action review, the sureties being 4 citizens from the same class of the strategi. There was a boule, that's a council, and this is also going to become one of the, kind of ancestral or central bodies, political bodies in Athens, right? There was a boule of 401 members selected by lot from the citizen body. So already you see under Draco, right? Draco the vicious, Draco the violent, Draco whose laws are written in blood, right? You see this effort to take justice out of the hands of the powerful with their whims, right? And it remains kind of a mystery, right? How it might be that this is this is so, right? Why is it that this place started moving in this direction? In some sense, as I've mentioned with allusions to, the Anglo-Saxons and to Beowulf and so forth, this is some of these things are natural, right? But it's not at all a guarantee that what happens next is going to happen, because the people around Athens, people like Megara, the Athens' sort of perennial rival with whom it fought for control over places like Salamis, right? They had, in the period that immediately follows this, they had a very, very different kind of political transformation. So what basically seems to now strike the Greek world is some kind of food shortage, essentially, or economic, let's call it economic deprivation. And again, our sources are somewhat ambiguous, but in Athens, at least, what you have is a crisis of indentured servitude, sort of like an extreme feudalism, but based on the fact, effectively, that people are just not succeeding in their farms, and they're having to yoke themselves in forms of debt to the rich and the powerful, to the big wealthy families, the noble families that have a lot of money or a lot of land or a lot of grain or whatever. And this becomes a greater and greater crisis, not only because, people are suffering terribly, but because the actual citizenry, the lifeblood of Athens, or the population, let's say, even more than the citizenry, the population of Athens is being drained or sold into slavery. So people are finding that they can't grow enough on their farms, right? Then they're indebting themselves, right, to the wealthy, and they become what's called hectamoroi. And that means either, so it has something to do with a sixth of their produce, right? So either they're giving a sixth of their produce to their patrons, to the people they are in debt to, or they're keeping a sixth and giving 5/6. It seems more likely that it's 1/6, because living off of 1/6 of your land would be, completely impossible. But when you can't pay these debts back, eventually there's nothing left to offer except yourself, except your body, right? And so, getting sold abroad into slavery or being indebted into slavery to your sort of feudal lord becomes kind of a regular thing. That this underclass of the hectamoroi is growing and growing. And as we know from studying the history of Rome, as we know from talking about our own kind of, economic and power inequalities, having an underclass is just bad mojo. It's bad mojo for a million different reasons: ethical, moral, but also, political. Right? You're dealing with something that is fundamentally unsustainable. And in other places, right, you get revolutions, you get revolts that end up in the establishment of a tyrant. I really like what Don Kagan says about this. Don Kagan is a professor at Yale, and when I was there, gave phenomenal lecture series on the history of Greece. And he says, typically when the poor revolt in crises like this, what they want is a redistribution of land. And a redistribution of land means civil war. And this is one reason why, we talked so much about the propositions under the Gracchi, right, who were proposing a form of land redistribution, which, in some ways, at some points in time, was just a reversion to what the law was supposed to be. But nevertheless, right, the impossibility of doing that, of actually coming to somebody and saying, give me your land so the government can give it to somebody else. This is why reparations is such a damaging and dangerous idea, right, is that when you take somebody's land away, they're just not going to let you, right? And so this is what you get in places like Megara. You basically get tyranny, because when people perform acts of revolution, leading people to devour the property of other people, who's going to do that, right? The tyrant. And the tyrant, even if the tyrant is relatively mild, as we're going to get into in a second, the tyrant nevertheless is a tyrant. That is to say that you've now established a form of rule by one man. Something now happens in the history of Athens, which is beyond my power or capacity to explain, except with reference to the providence of God and the reality of individuals in history. And that is the arrival of Solon on the scene. Solon, one of the 7 great sages of Greece. And we'll see why in a second, because for all that he is kind of he's very good at making his own PR. He writes poetry about his own work, right, and how great he was. He genuinely does perform an amazing deed here, which is he works out a compromise to adjudicate this crisis without establishing a tyranny and maintaining these ancestral ideas about how Athens is to be run. So he's not going to establish democracy. That's still to come. But he is going to do a couple of important things. It's kind of a great reset, although not of the extreme variety that we're used to thinking about when we talk about the Great Reset. It's called a seisachtheia. It's from the Greek word to shake and the Greek word for burden, shaking up the burdens. He's shaking things up. But the seisachtheia does this. It abolishes all debt based on personhood, all effectively debt slavery, right? And this involves even bringing people back from overseas slavery, from foreign slavery. But he does not abolish any other debt. So it's the abolition solely of selling your body. It's basically of indentured servitude. He says you can't do this anymore. And those debts are now abolished, and we're going to have a reset on that. But what we're not going to do is have total debt forgiveness, right? When you think about the way that we have fought over debt forgiveness lately with student loans, right, you realize how incredibly difficult this is. Because what happened when Biden gave forgave $10,000 of debt, which basically just meant, as far as I can tell, completely unconstitutionally, declaring, right, under the pretense of COVID, that you now just have to pay for somebody else's college degree, essentially. What happened? Well, immediately he was met with cries from the left, right, from his left, that this was nowhere near enough. And interestingly, there's a way in which that's kind of true, in that like $10,000, if you have student loans, that $10,000 is probably not going to really change your actual like status. And that's why it tends so often to be a snowball, right? Because then people just want more and more. Once the government starts, redistributing wealth in this way, it's very, very difficult to put a cap on it. And Solon basically puts a cap on it by identifying people as something that can't be held as debt, or something that at least is no longer going to be held as debt. That's the debt he's going to forgive. And so he finds that line to draw. He doesn't forgive other debt, and he doesn't redistribute land. And this is the other kind of crucial thing. And like any good compromise, it makes absolutely everybody unhappy. And Solon writes poetry about this. He said, another person in my shoes would have sided with the rich or with the poor. I would have either kept things exactly as they were. I would have kept, amassing wealth in these few households, or I would have given everything to the poor like some of these other tyrants did and kind of rode to power on their support. And instead, I did neither of those things. And now I'm getting the hell out of Dodge, because the next thing he does is basically self-impose exile. He makes them agree to keep the laws in place for 10 years, and then he just pieces. And this is a smart move on his part. But it bears repeating that what you now have at this crucial juncture in Greek history, this complete hothouse plant, this accidental emergence of something that is nevertheless trending in a direction, right, that is leading Athens in a roundabout way to a purer and purer form of what will eventually be its constitution, which is one of isonomia and isegoria, which is freedom of speech, essentially, the right to speak at the assembly. but we're not there yet. And there's a rocky road ahead. So let's now talk about the advent of the tyrants. Y'all know I like to eat healthy. You know I'm choosy about what I eat, and that is why I am excited to bring you Field of Greens. This is a really cool new addition to your diet, and I'm not calling it a supplement, and I'm not calling it anything like that, because I think when you say that, people get this idea that you're talking about some weird chemical extract or something that's like maybe highly artificial, and that's not what Field of Greens is at all. It's a full spectrum of essential vegetables and fruits, plus science-backed herbs and prebiotics. And you can tell when you drink it that it's real food. I mean, that is what's most important to me, though it's also fasting friendly, which is also great because I'm an intermittent faster. So if you are, Field of Greens is for you. It's really, really hard, almost impossible to get all of the servings of fruits and vegetables you're supposed to get every day while you're also trying to eat all the other things, hit all your macros and all that other stuff, right? So check out Field of Greens just to get that kind of incorporated into your diet, round out your diet. It has all sorts of amazing benefits for your skin, for your energy, for your weight, whatever you're trying to do, whatever you're trying to fix. Go to fieldofgreens.com and use the promo code Heretics to get 15% off your first order and 10% off when you subscribe for recurring orders. That's fieldofgreens.com, promo code Heretics, fieldofgreens.com, promo code Heretics. So Solon doesn't actually fix the underlying dynamics, right? There's still this kind of these ancestral grievances, which have been in some ways alleviated by the written laws of Draco, but which also, nevertheless, right, are present in this kind of extreme wealth inequality, present in this, indentured servitude that's now been absolved, but people are still kind of grumbling at each other. But he's bought us some time, right? During that time, you're going to get a factional conflict between basically three great houses, which are in three different regions of the Athenian, of Attica, right, of the Athenian territory. And you have Lycurgus, whom I'm mentioning first because he's going to be the sort of the least important guy to think about. And then you have the Alcmaeonids, led by the wonderfully named Megacles, who I believe fought Optimus Prime in Transformers 3 or something. But this is the family of the Alcmaeonids, who are going to be very important throughout the rest of Greek history. And then you have the populist, Pisistratus. Now, Pisistratus, another famous name, and this is the guy that kind of wants to he's democratic in the kind of Greek pejorative sense of the word, that he kind of rallies the people behind him with promises of some form of that they're going to get goodies, essentially. He's a great warrior, great in military battles with Megara. And so he takes power 3 different times. The first time he effectively demands a bodyguard, which he then used. Personal bodyguards, always never a good sign, right? Somebody starts asking for a personal bodyguard to walk around, you sort of start raising your eyebrows. He demands a personal bodyguard and uses this to take power. This doesn't last super long. He's ousted, and Megacles and the Alcmaeonids kind of take their turn at the helm. But then he comes back in one of the most enjoyable and endearing ways we know of from this period of history. He gets a hot chick. And we should say that the one thing he does, by the way, is he marries the daughter of Megacles. So he kind of makes an alliance there with the Alcmaeonids. He gets a hot chick and he puts her in a chariot and he dresses her up as Athena and he sends her through the countryside of Athens saying, Athena demands the return of Pisistratus. And Pisistratus is back, baby. Which also doesn't last very long because another salacious tidbit from this period in history, because he's not performing his husbandly duties. He's either not consummating the marriage at all, or some sources say he's not consummating the marriage as he should, which is kind of a suggestive idea there. But in any case, either way, it seems like what he's trying to do is protect his bloodline because he's got children from a previous marriage. He doesn't want, Megacles' descendants to inherit his realm, his reign. But this leads Megacles to kick him back out again. He's exiled a second time, comes back yet a third time, and this time he just takes the place by force. He just marshals an army, gets a bunch of allies on his side and takes over. Pisistratus known for a kind of gentle form of rule. He leaves a lot of the government in place and effectively just becomes, I think it's Kagan who says he becomes kind of like a mob boss, right? So he puts all his people in power, but he's pretty gentle. And some people look back with real sympathy for this time of tyranny, right? And this is something that you still see, right? You still say, well, tyranny can be great. Look at what a great job, look at how benevolent the World Economic Forum could be, right? And this is one of the things, crucial things I think for us to recall. We don't object to tyranny because it always produces bad outcomes. We object to tyranny because it is inherently less just per se than isonomia, right? And this history, which is so full of twists and turns and accidents, right, is revealing this over time as a form of government which is itself just in itself, ruling and being ruled in turn, right? That's where we're going here. What happens? Another salacious story, again, ambiguous in our sources, but Pisistratus dies. He's got two sons, Hippias and Hipparchus. Hippias is the good one. We like Hippias. He's clement. He's like his father. He's wise. Hipparchus is kind of a lout. And he's, known for being kind of irresponsible, being a bit over the top and so forth. He makes a pass at this guy, Harmodius. And now Harmodius, depending on which sources you consult, a little bit ambiguous, but Harmodius seems to have a lover already, Aristogeiton. And he rejects Hipparchus' advances, which leads to an obvious rupture between this private citizen and this sort of intemperate tyrant, right? There's a public insult. Hipparchus makes a public insult toward Harmodius' family, Harmodius' sister. The two, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, they had to plot to kill both of them, or at least to kill Hippias. They end up killing Hipparchus only, and Hippias kind of becomes a bit of a tyrant. He becomes paranoid. He fears for his power. And this is now becomes an unsustainable situation. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Megacles has also sired his own children, has his own inheritors, among whom is this guy Cleisthenes, another Alcmaeonid, whose family has been paying for the restoration of the Delphic oracle. And so lo and behold, anytime the Spartans contact the Delphic oracle to ask what to do, the Delphic oracle says, first, free Athens. And so now you've got this guy, this king in Sparta, who joins forces with Cleisthenes and takes control effectively, kicks the Pisistratids out, and now we're really going to get democracy. After a couple other sort of squabbles, we get, in fact, we get a fight between this guy Cleisthenes and this guy Isagoras, and Cleisthenes himself becomes an unlikely champion, right, of the people, because the Spartans are sort of oligarchs, right? The Spartans want a sort of oligarchic form of government, or sort of suppose there's going to be an oligarchic form of government. And so when Cleisthenes and Isagoras get to fighting, and Cleisthenes starts to be the man of the people all of a sudden, Cleomenes becomes his enemy and has to be shut up in the Acropolis, has to be sort of encircled by this massive force led by Cleisthenes, who now takes control and institutes what will become the Athenian democracy. And now we're up to the part of the story that we already know about, which is the part that I've been talking about, right? This ecclesia, right, which is the kind of sovereign body open to all citizen men, right? Summoned by a boule, by a council, and told what to discuss by the boule, but able then to come back to the boule and say, you need to write us up another docket for this, this, and this, or whatever. You now have courts of law, right? This was another big Solonic kind of innovation, was courts of appeal. You have courts of jurors of one's peers, right? This whole thing has come into flourishing and flower over the course of people being total messes, right? A total dumpster fire of human caprice and failure and venality, right? And all of these things have combined to shape into something that is actually one of the jewels of Western history. It's an amazing miracle when you really think about it, and so precious and rare that it can only possibly have been guided by the providence of God and the natural form of government, right, which was coming into being in this Aristotelian sense. As I mentioned, it's called not democracy. Democracy is the name that gets thrown at it by its detractors because the demos are the kind of lower down people, right? And one of the things, by the way, that's happened up to this point, and this is Cleisthenes' big innovation, is that the tribes, the ancestral tribes of Athens, are now going to be completely reshuffled. So this is really, a kind of radical abolition of tribalism. There were 4 tribes traditionally in Athens, and each named after a hero, a mythological hero. Now there are going to be 10, and they're going to be, sort of geographically spread out. They're divided into thirds, trities, and the trities come from these things called demes, which are sort of local, regional areas. And this is going to effectively redistribute power, right, and redistribute allegiance, even, because you're going to also fight side by side with members of your same tribe, and all of this, which came along also with the incorporation of foreigners, right, were suddenly able to gain citizenship. This is kind of Solonic, but the thing, the idea that basically you don't have to be born to an Athenian man, to a citizen, in order to become a citizen. You can gain citizenship in certain other ways. Basically, it's a skills-based immigration policy that they adopt, that opens their citizenship, and then they kind of create this system under which, as we learn from the Aristotelian school, they have this saying that they me philokrinein, that is, do not judge according to tribe, right? So we're going to scrub the tribes clean, effectively, of the kind of things that might give birth to prejudice. Now, you can say that this is actually kind of a, in some sense, dehumanizing or denaturing move, right? But it does produce this situation, right, in which the isonomia of the state is final and complete. That is, it has kind of taken on its final form. And local personal allegiances aren't going to go away, right? You're not, they weren't kind of trying to abolish them altogether. They were just trying to scrub the state clean insofar as possible, the law clean, of these sorts of prejudices. And here you have, right, coming into being, again, miraculously, a government of laws and not of men. And so when somebody like DeSantis, right, gets up and says, look, when a DA or a public official refuses to enforce the law because of his personal convictions, however noble they may be, right, it doesn't matter how well tyranny works, right? This is what I said before, right? It's not because they don't have good ideas sometimes, these people, right? Or it's not because they, have these disastrous policies, although in fact, often they do, right? It's because people, men, based on their personal preferences and their allegiances and their kind of tribal associations, don't get to decide what the law is, right? This is not the natural state of man. I mean, it is natural in the sense of kind of this Aristotelian final development, right? This kind of teleological essence of things. But it's certainly not natural in the sense that this is usually what we're able to make our way to. It takes a lot of chance and a lot of providence to create the conditions under which this kind of government can thrive, and to throw it away because you're so virtuous that you know better than the founders or whatever, right, is the folly of the highest order. It is extreme self-sabotage, like a huge self-own, to just say, well, I'm going to decide what the law is because I'm the good guy, right? I think it was an LA Times piece, this trans person, they signed up to be in Child Protective Services, and now Governor Greg Abbott is trying to kill children away from parents who want to put their children through gender transition, which means these forms of hormone alteration, and in some extreme cases castration, right? These kind of really gruesome practices that we shouldn't even be discussing, that shouldn't even be on the table, right? And certain states are trying to fight back against this. And the idea that this person, because I can't remember if it was male to female or female to male, but this person, because they happen to be trans, right? Therefore, right, it shouldn't have to enforce this law, right? That's government of men and not of laws, right? That's why we're objecting to it. It's not because we want to be nasty to whoever. It's not because we're big meanies that just want to, bring down the hammer on everybody. It's because this inheritance is precious. Adams knew it, right? He was looking back to this wisdom of antiquity, which they were enshrining now, doing their best to enshrine in our republican form of government. And I should say, of course, right, that we don't have this Athenian form of government. The thing that I'm drawing out of this, more than, the ecclesia, the council that decide things, or the dicasterion, or, any of this, more than these particular bodies or rules, right? The isonomia and the isegoria, right? If anybody can speak, freedom of the invention, effectively, of freedom of speech, and laws apply to all, equality before the law, right? These are hothouse plants, man. They are jewels, and it takes a lot of work and effort and luck, right, to establish them as principles and to enshrine them, and to throw that all away because of your like fire of moral passion is truly folly of the highest magnitude. Is to doom yourself on the basis of your own self-regard. So I hope this has been instructive. These stories to me are just so fun. I can't get over how fun they are. And I want to read to close something that we've visited these passages before. But I wanted to note to you that these sorts of political histories, right, can help us to understand the way that Athens represents itself in tragedy and in art, right? We did a whole series on the Oresteia, which is Aeschylus trilogy, the only full surviving trilogy from this, from the classical period, from the period of great Greek tragedies, which tells the story first of Agamemnon's return home from the Trojan War, and then of his murder by Clytemnestra, his wife, and then finally of Orestes avenging this murder and wrapping himself up in exactly one of those blood feuds that Draco's laws existed to bring to a close, right? And so that trilogy is about this development, right? And it represents it in mythological terms, not because I don't think, right? I mean, there's not even, this whole thing doesn't even take place in Athens, right? This is a story that's been transmuted to another location that nevertheless, right, finally in the end leads us to Athens because it's Athena, right, who's going to make the judgment between Apollo, who's Orestes' defender, and the Furies, right? The chorus of Furies who want blood. And they are the spirits, right? They are the embodiment, the divine, chthonic, mythological embodiment of that blood justice. And they are older than the Olympian gods, right? Remember that there are many generations of gods in Greek mythology, right? They're older than the Olympian gods, and Athena is in some sense this, new arrival. And they, when in the end, right, they take a vote, and Athena casts the deciding vote, and she does so out of her personal predilection. So Aeschylus, too honest an artist to suggest that this is just going to be, smooth sailing and dispassionate, kind of unbiased judgment from now on, right? He knows that there are still going to be personal attachments, but he still believes that what's going on here is a kind of sublimation of these ancient forces. It's not that they're being exiled altogether. That's another point of genius, right? They don't get exiled, they get transformed. Let me read to you now from the chorus of Furies reacting to this judgment that Orestes is going to be forgiven, right? He's going to get off. Here's the chorus. Gods of the younger generation, you've dishonored the old laws. You've snatched them from my own hands. And I, now with no honor, wretched and with anger heavily weighing on me, shall spew upon this land the vindictive poison, the poison in my heart, and I will let it drip upon it to dry up its soil, and from this shall breed a cancer to cause its leaves and flowers to drop and die. O justice, justice will fall upon the earth and spit upon the city. Murderous blotches. I sigh aloud. What am I doing? I shall become intolerable to this city. The poor daughters of the night have suffered ills insufferable and grieve for their dishonor. And Athena, this is a long back and forth between Athena and this chorus, who is insisting that they have not been dishonored. She says, you are still goddesses, and so do not, in excessive anger, make this land of mortals uninhabitable. I, too, am answerable to Zeus. But so what? And I alone of all the gods know where he keeps the keys to his armory, where his thunderbolts are, yet we do not need them. Only listen to me, and do not curse this land with such excessive anger that it will render it fruitless in dire misery. Put to rest your billowing bile, and you shall be much honored when you're here with me, and you shall have this land's first offerings on births and marriages, and then you'll forever remember my advice. He says, you're older than me, so I shall overlook your anger, but even though you might be wiser than me, Zeus has also given me some wisdom. Don't throw bloody discord in my land that destroys the souls of youth. Let war come from outside, and when it does, let every man feel passionately the love of glory. Battles must not be like those of birds, conducted in their own coop. Such are the blessings that I give you with my own hand. Do good, receive good, and be honored as good are honored, and thus have a portion of this most God-beloved land. And this is going to become the role of the Furies transmuted into the Eumenides, right? That they are going to have a kind of, they're effectively going to be channeled and oriented toward the good. Whereas before they were just this, unrelenting force of anger and hurt, right? Of angst and anguish, and of past pain. Athena, goddess of wisdom, right? Who also says that she has the goddess of persuasion in her mouth, essentially. Athena is going to shape their impulses outward, right? When war comes, let every man love glory. But for you, right, bless marriages, right? Those who do honor to you, who respect the kind of chthonic, the ancient ancestral forces of this land, will prosper, and yet they will live under the new laws, right, of isonomia. It's a beautiful artistic depiction of all the history that we've just been talking about, and kind of in this Aristotelian formal way, right? It embodies in myth, right, the divine story that was going on while all of this human squabbling was happening. And it's important, I think, I'll close with this. It's important for us to remember that we too, in all of our ineptitude and all of our squabbling and all of the things that seem to be going terribly, terribly wrong, right, are also being led towards something purer and higher than ourselves, than we ourselves can muster. If we continue orienting ourselves toward the good, right, we solve each question as best we can when it's in front of us, then even our flaws and our failings may yet be used to the glory of God. And this is actually, encapsulated in this play, in this history, and in that notion of isonomia and isegoria, which we must not throw away. Let's do the mailbag. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals, which is at youngheretics.com/locals. You can go there to join our community, which is a really awesome group of people who love this show, love the ideas we talk about on this show, and want to take them further, want to enact them in life, which is crucial. That's the point of my book, How to Save the West, which you can pre-order now, by the way. And it's also the point of our VIP community on Locals. You get all sorts of extra goodies when you join, including translation and commentary on Romans that I've been doing. But you also get to be in the mailbag, and you get to do weekly live stream Q&As as well. So here's Antisocial Critic. As a Protestant, I find myself in deep disagreement with my Catholic and Orthodox friends over questions like those of Marianism or other serious questions of faith. As a side note, one of the things that Solon did that we didn't mention is he made it, he made it illegal to keep out of a public conflict so that everybody would have a stake in some sort of major public fight. Repeatedly, their answer is that Protestantism is not the religion of the Church Fathers, which seems to be mostly true, with the caveat that most Protestant ideas existed within the Church Fathers in some form. How do you defend your faith from accusations of heresy or falsity, especially as large sections of the Church appear to be atrophying or breaking down? Does modern Protestantism suffer from being detached to apostolic succession? Well, this is a serious problem, and Protestantism has a lot to answer for, right? We see a lot of problems in the Protestant Church. I would note, by the way, that the Catholic Church is not exempt from this. The woke takeover of Catholic churches is also very real and proceeds apace. So the record on this is sort of spotty on both sides, and I would suggest that is one way into answering this question. Because when we look at something like wokeness, what we're dealing with is a Western problem and a church-wide problem, right? We are dealing with something that has affected all forms of life and worship in the West. And so I wouldn't hold Protestantism's devolution into wokeness against it, in part because it's not unique to Protestantism. In some sense, wokeness is a virulent, degraded strain of Protestantism, but that's not the only thing it is. It's also Marxism, right? It's also any number of other. It has any number of other strands of intellectual DNA, and so then we get to this apostolic succession question, and to me, it's key what you say that a lot of the Protestant ideas that people like Luther and Calvin were defending existed within the Church Fathers. And we actually had a whole conversation on Locals about sola fide and the minutiae, right, of what was really being argued over. Because in fact, the idea that faith saves, right, was well present in the church, right? Really what you're looking at in the Protestant Reformation is you're looking at a claim that these ancient ideas, which have existed throughout the history of Christendom, have gradually become corrupt and taken on unnecessary accretions, including things like indulgences, right? And so to say that the Church Fathers were Catholic, or some of them Greek Orthodox, right? But to say that the Church Fathers were Catholic is true in a sense, But it's also not true in the sense that the question had not yet been posed, right? And the crisis in the history of Christianity that was going on at the time, which was also a crisis in epistemology, right? How do we know things? And an authority. How do we know absolute truth? That crisis was not going to not occur, right? It was inevitable to anybody who had eyes to see. There were obvious problems with putting men in charge of religious institutions, or at least giving men final authority over religious institutions. And so I would suggest that Protestants are definitely guilty of jettisoning the church fathers or ignoring their wisdom or saying all sorts of things that would make any number of church fathers into heretics, right? We do get overly dogmatic about these things in sola scriptura, meaning that only the letter of scripture can ever, can interpret itself, and it's fully self-sufficient, right? These things don't really hold up under scrutiny, and we say them only because we're getting worked up into a froth, right? The actual debates are much more subtle than that. They have to do, for instance, with forgiveness, right? Who can offer and receive and ask for forgiveness from God, right? Does it come direct, or does it come mediated by a priest? And in that sense, right, there's all sorts of discussion of these questions in the tradition. It faces a crisis that hadn't yet come into being. And so to retroject that crisis backward and to claim Augustine or Aquinas for Catholicism over Protestantism, or for Protestantism over Catholicism, seems anachronistic to me. I would say that we should argue the argument that we're having, right, from the perspective that it's been had over the last several hundred years, right? The question has to do with authority, right? Where does authority come from? How do we know? How do we connect? How do we know that we are speaking to God or encountering God and not just putting our own words into God's mouth? And that is a question to which Protestants and Catholics have very, very different answers. But it's not the same kind of question as are you a heretic, right? Have you diverged from the true faith by having a different answer about Mary than the Pope, right? It seems to me like that gets the question wrong at a number of different levels. And I would suggest, asking these fundamental epistemological questions, right? Well, so what exactly is it about the church, right, the Pope, that makes him the bearer of, the final word on this tradition in the last analysis? Those sorts of questions, I think, are much more contemporary than the things that, yes, have been said in the tradition. Things like, faith saves, right, have been part of the tradition, and the relationship between faith and works have been part of the Christian tradition forever. It's just that they came to a crisis. All forms of knowing, right, came to a crisis during this time. And so I would say we're not heretics any more than the Catholics are. We are having a debate within Christianity about how best to carry forward the history up to the point of the eruption of that debate. I hope that helps. And above all things, there must be love, right? So I hope that you and your friends engage in these debates out of love for one another and delight in one another, and even perhaps in your differences and disputes, because that is kind of the whole point, right? All right. Thank you all for listening. As always, it's such a joy to be with you. If you like this work, you will love the Claremont Institute, which is my employer. They put out the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, both stellar publications, in my humble opinion. And you can donate to support us at claremont.org/donate. Mention when you do that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics. That's it for me. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.